Have you ever been told that something you're working in is impossible, can't be done, won't be done, is impossible given the time constraints or budget constraints? If you do, I think you might like this next panel. Let's introduce our next guests to you as we see them appear on the screen. It's very good to see them all joining me. Insiya, Jennifer and Mert, a very warm welcome to you. Let me tell you who's here. Jennifer Holmgren of ZARA Tech, good afternoon to you. Insiya Jafferjee of the Shell Works. Hello, Insiya, lovely to see you again. And Mert Geveci. Have I got that right, Mert? Geveci.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Director of Digital Technologies at Malta Inc. Here, one and all, to discuss the art of the impossible. Why don't we just get straight into it? But before we do, in the abstract, let's get some more on what you're each up to. Jennifer, tell us more. ZARA Tech, you're in the business, I think, partly of carbon recycling. Tell us a little bit more.
Absolutely. So what we do is we take waste carbon emissions, like at a steel mill, or even solid emissions at a municipal solid waste site, and we convert them through to fuels and chemicals. So we've been able to fly on aviation fuel made from recycled carbon emissions. ZARA introduced a dress. So basically our mission is to absolutely transform where the carbon in all of your products comes from. We want it to come from waste, not fresh fossils.
Yeah, you're quite a legend at doing this, Jennifer. What do you think it is about you that draws you to tough problems?
I like platforms, and I really love putting steel in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. No, good riddance. So, Insiya, tell me a bit more. You're part of the war on plastic. How?
Yeah, so I guess our vision is to create a plastic-free future. The way that we're aiming to do that today is we've created a material from microbes. And what's amazing about it is that they build up this material energy storage just as we would have fat in our body. But when you create it into a product and throw it away, the same microbes see it as food in a natural soil or marine environment and break it down, preventing the pollution that we see today.
So hang on, when we talk about microbes, this is effectively taking bacteria and turning them into a new product.
Exactly, yeah. So
hang on, where are you getting the bacteria from then?
So it comes from those solid marine environments. So it's almost like you take the bacteria that do this already, and then when you throw your products away, the same bacteria see it as food and break it down.
Love it. So give us an example of where you've got it and something that you've created.
So one of the areas is actually wastewater municipal sludge, because they're really hardy. They have to survive, and so they're really good at doing this. And then some of the products that we've created from it today are, things like these little bottles or bottle caps. These are kind of our first use cases that we've created.
Love it. Municipal sludge. That's a sanitized way of describing it, isn't it? Jennifer, it sounds like Insiya is a fellow traveller, actually. I think you'd get on.
Yeah.
Now tell me something, Mert. Is it true that Malta Inc. span out of Google's Moonshot Factory?
Yeah, it certainly is. If you look at the idea, it's basically a collection of established technologies that are maybe 20, 30 years old, put together in a different way. So the original idea, it was the brainchild of a Stanford professor who's also a Nobel laureate. And in 2015, it became a project at Google X. And, the way X works is basically they try to find everything that will kill an idea. So they spent 2 years trying to kill the idea, techno-economics, from a technical perspective, but it survived. And in 2018, it was spun off as an independent company. Our CEO, Ramya Swaminathan, led the spin-off out of Google X and the Series A fundraise. And here we are, about 3 years later.
Well, hang on, though, I mean, that's that's a whistle-stop tour. But just how involved were you in those very early stages? Because you've got an extremely accomplished record in larger corporates. Were you involved in that genesis? Because I'm very interested by that tension of poking at the impossible, but trying to kill it off as well. That seems like a tension.
Yeah, so it certainly was. And again, I feel like, I never worked for X, and I wasn't around for when Malta was a part of X. But there's definitely, they are in the business of finding the impossible, right? So, if we, go back and look at what they were doing, and they were exactly actually, in general, what they were trying to do was their approach is to prove that something is impossible so that they can eliminate it. They kind of take pride in how many ideas they eliminate on a given year. And because the ones that survive essentially are the stronger ones. I did not join the company until middle of 2019. So, startups, things kind of come in waves. Series A fundraise. I was a part of that first wave, which makes me an old timer at a startup like Malta, which I realized just a few weeks back when I say, "Oh, I've been here for almost 3 years." Oh, yeah, you've been here for a while. So, but yeah,
it's all relative. All right.
What's that?
No, carry on, Mert.
I was just going to say, when I came along, what was seen as impossible was probably still around the market. There's no need, or, this is never going to be cost competitive, both the product itself and your charging electricity, right? Because our system takes electricity, stores it, and then discharges it. If you don't have cheap, renewable electricity coming in, then you don't really have much of a function. But we're at a point where that case is so well established that impossible for most people is gone. It's more around how do we store that cheap electricity and how do we make it always available? That's the question, and that's the problem we're trying to solve.
Right. So it's about energy storage. But tell me, where does sort of heat and cold come into this then, Mert? Because you've got different ways that you can work, right?
Yeah. So what we do is, let's just think about offshore wind, right? So your offshore wind may be blowing, at really high speed and be making a lot of electricity for 2 days in a row. And on the third day, the wind might just die, like it happened in the UK back in September, where you might have a month or two of very low average wind speed. So that means there isn't a lot of wind output. So what our system does is when the wind is blowing at full speed, you have excess electricity. We take that excess electricity, we run a heat pump with it. It's essentially like your air conditioning at home, just very, very large and going to high and low temperatures on each side. And then what we do is we heat up a molten salt. So that's basically just your typical salt, but it's in a liquid form. That's our hot fluid. And then we have a coolant, like the coolants in your car, on the cold side, and we cool that down. So to give you an idea, on the hot side, it's 565 degrees Celsius. On the cold side, -60. So it's very hot and very cold. And that's what our heat pump does. And when the wind dies, then it's time, and the grid needs the electricity back because, you need to turn on your oven or the heat in your home. We reverse the cycle, and we run what's called the heat engine. It's the opposite of that very same cycle. And we convert that temperature differential on the hot side and the cold side back to electricity. Very similar to how a thermal power plant works today. It's just that we don't burn anything. We just use the heat that we pumped during the charging stage.
Yes, got it. No, thank you, Mert. So let's dig into this because there's so much that I want to ask you about this topic. Jennifer, ever been told something's impossible?
I get told something's impossible pretty much every day. I can start historically. I remember in 2005 being told that nobody would ever be able to fly on a drop-in replacement sustainable aviation fuel, that only petroleum fossil-derived aviation fuel would ever be used commercially. 5 years later, we had not only made sustainable aviation fuel, we had actually flown an F-18, the Green Hornet, on Earth Day 2010. It went supersonic. So 5 years from it can't be done to it's being done. The same thing on aviation when I came to ZARA Tech. And we decided that, the cheapest waste-derived feedstock would be ethanol, that we could take waste and turn them into ethanol, and ethanol would become the carbon and the energy carrier that we could then convert those wastes through to jet fuel, sustainable jet fuel, a hydrocarbon. And everybody said, well, that's just ridiculous because it takes more gallons of ethanol than the hydrocarbon jet fuel. But we're doing it now, and everybody realizes that on a BTU basis, you're actually better off making the hydrocarbons. So you're not losing anything starting with ethanol, and that ethanol is the right intermediate. And again, it's just the problem is that if people haven't done it before and it seems disruptive, it's so easy for the guy on the couch to just say, hey, it's never going to work, right? So over and over again, we prove them wrong.
And Jennifer, on reflection, when you're going through those chapters in your life, to what extent did you believe it could be done? Or did you simply hope it could be done, but in truth, you didn't really know either?
Well, I mean, as long as it doesn't violate a law of thermodynamics, it can be done, right? I mean, the science, as long as the science is sound, right, then really it comes down to getting it done and making sure the economics works. That's always the question, right? Yes, you tackle it because you know it can be done. And then the question is, can it be done in a way that makes market sense, economic sense? So,
right.
No, it's not a hope. Hope isn't enough.
Okay, got it, right. Insiya, how do you tackle this word? You've been told what you're doing is impossible.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, everything you said, Jennifer, really resonates, because I think maybe we hear a similar word, but maybe I thought, on contrast, I could talk about an early story when it was just three of us in the shed, and we were like, yep, we're going to start this business, and we got £20,000, and everyone was like, there's no way that you can build a business on £20,000, especially a hardware business, right? But I think fundamentally, I think it's just, it's about a framework. So if you have a goal and a set of challenges, you learn how to problem solve that within those set of constraints. So for us, it was £20,000. We had to create products. So we went to scrap yards. We got aluminum. We melted it down. We made some molds, and then we made the products. And I think that's kind of the approach we apply to every so-called impossible problem, is like there's a set of constraints and a problem we need to solve. Like, how do we get to that end result?
Yeah, it's a great reframe, isn't it? It's actually driving your resourcefulness and your entrepreneurship. Mert, what does that word impossible trigger in you?
It probably triggers challenges around scale, right? So, our particular technology, you can build a small version of it, but, the obvious advantage is if you build a really big one. So, when we came into this industry, the assumption was that, well, you're a startup. The word hard tech, and it's not even enough in some ways to define what we do, because it's hard tech and it's at very large scale. So the first plant that we want to build is 100 megawatts. So it is a grid scale. So even to build the first plant, you need to be able to scale very large equipment. So that was always the question. How will you be able to come to this market and have this large equipment, without coming in on the low end, with smaller equipment? And really for us, the key to unlocking that was our partners. So, yes, we could not build a factory to build, hundreds of megawatts worth of turbo machinery. We don't have the capital to do that, but Siemens does. So, we were basically able to leverage the changes in the industry. The equipment we need looks kind of like a combined cycle power plant gas turbine. So, and who makes that? Well, there are, several companies in the world who can do that. So we partnered with those companies, and
right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, Jennifer, isn't it? Because there's a temptation, isn't there, in business to say we've got it all figured out and just watch this space. Whereas Mert's hinting at an openness, a vulnerability that says there might be some things which we'll find, if not impossible, then very challenging. And that can be attractive.
Well, I mean, that's what science loves to do, right? That, like I said, I love to put steel on the ground, which means I love to scale, right? And so as long as we believe something is possible, then it's really just about a method, right? It really is about the tactics to get from an idea to an experiment in the lab, to a pilot plant, to a demonstration plant, and then to that. And, there's a lot of rules of the road, I think, that one needs to be very cognizant about. I always like to say what you don't want to do is build $100 million boat anchor. And that's really the big problem, right? When you're scaling, that if you want to be aggressive and you want to go fast, but you can't skip fundamental steps that teach you along the path. So there's, I think, a lot that needs to be done and needs to be done right. And so while I know we're all talking about all these things that are impossible, we just plow on, yes, but that doesn't mean the sound science, the sound engineering, the sound biology. You need to listen to those voices, at least.
So what I'd like from each of you then is a technique, because I would say that for many of the people that have told you something's impossible, they haven't really, with all due respect, mattered. You could afford to ignore them, to move on, to say, I'll see you when we cross the success threshold. Other people you need to convince. How do you do that? Insiya.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting word, convince, because I think I've never wanted to convince someone of anything. I've just wanted to present the facts of what's possible. So I think actually Jennifer said it in a really great way. So when we were going out, whether it be fundraising, I'm a first-time founder, I'm quite, I look young, people don't think I have the experience, like how do you know how to do these things? How do you know that the science is sound? A lot of different questions. But I think what I've always done is I listen to all those questions and then I collect data and information and I present it in a very clear and concise way, because ultimately what I'm hearing is that not that you don't think the tech is possible, it's you can't understand it. So how do I make it so that you can actually understand it and digest it so that it makes sense? And I think that's something I try to do again and again.
Yeah, it is a really interesting point, Mert, that it becomes a challenge of communication. What technique would you bring in response to that question?
Was that to me, Ali?
Yeah, particularly when you've had somebody that said, Mert, I don't believe you. And you realize that this person has to be, well, to use Insiya's framing, educated, if that's not too passive aggressive.
Yeah, like different parts of my career, I've taken different approaches to that. I feel like the approach that I used to take was to, bury them in data and analysis. And then later on, I started to kind of realize that alone, for me, wasn't enough. Because usually the sticking point, I find that the technical points one can get through if you can build the confidence. So that takes time, but you can do it, kind of what Insiya alluded to. You build that confidence if you're, always straightforward about the information you present. You build that confidence. But then there is the more subjective pieces, the economical pieces, right? So those are based on, projections of what is going to happen with markets and demand. This is something we struggle with in energy storage. Back in 2014, I was in this business with a battery design at GE, and that didn't work out. And it wasn't really the technology. So then you're really encouraging people to look at a crystal ball, and you look at the crystal ball that's in front of you and believe the crystal ball that's in front of you. So that's the point where I think the discussion is a little softer, where I think that word audacity kind of starts to come in, and you basically try to help people to vision a different future. But I try to reserve that for non-technical things. The non-technical things, just like Jennifer said, we should be able to show them. That machine should be spinning. We shouldn't be doing, PowerPoint engineering. You can always convince people if you can make the machine work at a smaller scale. Those stories are easier to tell. The economic stories, those are the ones that are maybe, for me as an engineer, that are harder to tell.
Yeah, got it. And Jennifer, I'm reluctant to move on because I suspect you're a martial artist on people standing in your way. So help me understand how you've disarmed them.
Well, I mean, it depends. I think you said it well when you said that Sometimes you don't have to convince people, you just move on. So the image in my head is always the penguins in Madagascar, smile and wave, always smile and wave, right? So there are a lot of times when all you can do is smile and wave and say, okay, thank you very much, and go off and get the data. At the end of the day, I think as you both said earlier, it's not about PowerPoint engineering. That's very eloquent comment, by the way. I love it. It's not about PowerPoint engineering. It's about actually building and running something. So my first piece is you don't need to convince everybody. And the ones you don't need to convince, just keep moving. Then on the other side of the equation, you've got to focus on the yeses. You're going to kiss a lot of frogs. And that's the only way I can think about it. And so what you've got to do is find the yeses, get the glimmer of understanding, and then disarm them and let them really fully join you on the journey. The ones that are saying no, you can't do it. I've never been that smart and that convincing.
Excellent. No, thank you, Jennifer. So just before we move on from that thought, Mert and Insiya, Shannon asks, particularly on the people that might have said no initially, are there any surprising outcomes and use cases of your technologies that came from pushing past a no? Or are you really in Jennifer's camp here of saying, move on? Any reflection on that?
I think for me, there's always value in a no. And I think whether it pushes the product to be defined in a different way, or you to communicate in a different way, or you understand your audience better, like Jennifer mentioned. So I think for me, there's value in the no's because it just makes me more robust through my thought process and growth.
Okay, and Mert, how do you respond to that question? Ever pushed past that to a surprising outcome?
Not necessarily pushing past through it. I kind of feel like you generally go around it, but then that comes back as a lesson to you, right? When, back in 2020, right in the beginning of a pandemic, we were starting our Series B fundraise. This was the first time I was involved in such a process, and our CEO, Rami, she coached me, basically said, look, we're going to talk to a lot of people. You're going to hear a lot of no's, and you need to be, that's how this process works. And then she was like, I'm sure you're not used to this, but we will probably talk to hundreds of people, and you need 5 investors. That's how many you need. But the thing is, that experience of 195 no's or whatever that was, if you actually absorb why, in many of those cases, why those are no's, next time around, you might be able to turn that around. They change their minds, the market evolves, right? Between 2020 and now, the electricity markets, the approach to electricity markets have changed dramatically.
Yes.
And then on top of that, we have learned, right, in terms of what was missing in our story and our path forward, what the investors were looking, what the market is looking for. And we have a very different story, even though it's the same product, same markets, we're trying to do the exact same thing,
right?
But we have a very different way of telling it.
I think it's a brilliant point, not to take a no as the chance to lose touch. There's a real nuance there, which I found fascinating. All right, well, so let's get really honest then. What about impossible today? What remains the wicked problem that you continue to face? That could be as a company, it could be more broadly across the industry. Jennifer, get us thinking. Be as blunt as you like.
Okay. Well, I think our current problem is time. If you think about the evolution of process technologies or new technologies, you go through a fundamental learning and prototyping, and you build the first one phase. And then once you build the first one, you build a couple more, you improve them, and then you reach that exponential diffusion part of the curve, right? And you saw that with solar. That sort of takes 30 years, right? You get to the point where people are complaining, it's still 10 years out and it will always be 10 years out. And then all of a sudden it goes from that to boom, exponential growth. You can't turn around till you see it. But that takes, for a disruptive idea, 30 plus years. We are in a race against time. There is no question that we have to bend the carbon curve, 50% reduction by 2030, and we haven't even flattened the curve, right? Now we've got 8 years to go from this to this, and we can't afford 30 years anymore. So to me, it's about scaling faster, crossing the valley of death, first commercial scale, faster, and diffusing faster. And that's the thing. I mean, that should terrify us, but it should also be exciting, right? Because it gives us all an opportunity to be better and faster. But that's the challenge.
Now, Mert, I'm sure that a lot of that will resonate. What about for you at Malta Inc.? What remains, quote, impossible?
I mean, it's exactly what Jennifer said, right? So in terms, for us as a company, the fundamentals of this market are here, right? The cheap electricity is here. The need for dispatchable electricity is definitely here. We will be okay. We will, we have a product that works for this market. Just at the pace that solar and wind came in, we will come in. So for us as a company, it's not what's impossible. But that pace, we're still going to go at the pace we did it before, and we're not necessarily going to be accelerating to that pace that we need to accelerate to. And that's really the challenge, right? So the whole market is full of 30-year assets. Some of those 30-year assets are being installed today. There are, coal and gas assets that are being installed today. That means they have certain economic realities associated with those. That's steel in the ground, right? Even if, what's coming is already cheaper, even before you think about carbon. But that pace is 30, 40, 50 years because, often it's cheaper to operate an asset you already have in the ground. So, and then think about our regulations, right? Our regulators are used to working at a certain pace, and they just need to outpace the market by this much. But now they need to outpace climate change. That's basically, they need to get in front of that. So that means that in order to enable a much faster transition, everybody has to move differently. So, I'll just say that again, right? We'll be okay as a company, but what we're trying to, accomplish as a mission for the planet, that's the hard one. That pace is, we've never done that before.
Yeah, no, understood. Insiya, your thoughts on this?
So I completely agree with Mert and both Jennifer. I think that's one of the challenges with building complex technology and trying to scale it rapidly while also waiting for the market to adopt it. So there's that tricky balance that you're playing. But I think another one is mistrust sometimes, I find. So at least in our industry, there have been a lot of people who have tried to solve this problem before or have eliminated conceptually that this problem might exist. And so, we're kind of fighting against the largest, for example, people thought something was biodegradable and then it turned out it wasn't. So we're fighting against that conception, both from a large corporation perspective, who are really afraid to do that again, but also from a consumer perspective, because now they don't understand what they're looking for, right? And so that's kind of one challenge that we're really up against, is how do you communicate something where there's so much misinformation already provided, and how do you communicate so clearly that people will understand it and do the right thing?
So what you're hinting at there, Insiya, is this idea that large global corporates might have lost legitimacy in some cases, and through not being straight with their customers.
I think so. And I think it's also due to what information that they had at the time, right? So it wasn't that they were trying to create mistrust, but it has created a lot of mistrust. And often those are the corporations that people go to understand something new. So it's kind of caused a little bit of imbalance, at least in our industry, where the thought leaders are now being critiqued. And it's great opportunities for startups, but it also is a challenge in itself for us.
Yeah. Jennifer, let me ask you a question it sits to the side of impossibility, but when you've had a relationship with a very large corporate over your career, whether that's at ZARA Tech or beyond, what has been at the core of the success of that healthy relationship? What has it really boiled down to? Because that's what we're trying to get to across this whole event today.
Well, and actually, every relationship is the same, right? Whether it's with a large corporate or your spouse, right? Relationship is based on building trust, right? And it's trust and respect for each other. And I think, as Insiya said, it's very hard sometimes with working with a corporate, because actually they have to align themselves internally, because inside their corporations, they're the ones saying no. And so you've got your champion that you build trust with, but you have to build trust across many levels. So I actually think that for a small company, it's super important to work with the large players because they have access to markets, they have supply chains, but it's a little bit like dancing with an elephant. And so you've got to be really careful in how you do it. And again, it's all about trust in my mind.
Yeah, I wondered whether we were going to have another Madagascar quote come out there. I'm just hoping we won't remind ourselves what the monkeys encouraged themselves to do. But anyway, you've sat on both sides of this, if I can put it like that. What would your message be to somebody from a very large corporation on the call that wanted to help startups navigate through the sort of impossible straits and have a better relationship, drawing on your GE experience?
I was hoping you were going to ask me the opposite, because I have 1,000, lines that I can give to somebody who's at a startup because I was on that other side for so long. And I feel like for an individual on the corporate side, it's a little harder, right? Because there is a whole bureaucracy to navigate and, how they help. And I think it's mostly around trying to understand, to help. It's more about communications than anything else. So I feel like on the corporate side, yes, you already know the methods to break the barriers because you try to break them for your own ideas, unless you've given up on things. But, I wasn't. So basically trying to, you know how to unlock the doors. So you help the startups unlock those doors. But I think the way you can help a little bit extra to the people on the startup side of it is trying to walk them through that maze that is that large corporation, because it isn't obvious, what the decision mechanisms are. And people who look very confident and they look like they're in charge, it turns out they're not, right? So the way to actually read in somebody's eye that they're not in charge, that is a skill that I think you can only really be taught by somebody who's been there.
Now we're getting down to it, but I can hear someone heckling, going, "Give us the one tip for the startup too, because we can't go without it." Just number one, go for it.
I think it's just the opposite of that. Basically, trying to figure out how to basically decode the power structures in a corporation like that, because you're going to, just because somebody seems interested and keeps talking to you doesn't mean they actually have the keys to the doors you need them to open. And then the other part of it is, again, I think, there's a lot about empathy that comes in business, trying to understand what's happening on the other side, not just trying to figure out how you're going to get yours done, but you first need to understand what's happening on the other side and what makes that corporation tick, right? And often it's not what you think. It may not even seem logical to you what's going to make that corporation tick, but it's about finding that key.
Yeah, got it. So we've just got 1 minute remaining. Jennifer, I don't want to end on a downer, but what do you say to somebody tuned in who is slightly feeling overwhelmed by the impossible, whichever their role within a startup or large corporate, that you must have had days a bit like that? What do you say to them? Oh no, Jennifer, just come off mute for me.
I'll never be as eloquent as that again. For me, the simple thing to tell an entrepreneur who's having a bad day is, you can do it. I know you can do it. I know you will do it. Just go do it.
Yeah, here. I mean, hard to top that, Insiya, but I've got to know you a bit, and I know you work within one of the world's great companies, Apple, before starting the Shell Works. What do you say?
I think build a community. It takes a village to build something, and especially if you're trying to do something really difficult, which often you are if you're an entrepreneur, then build a community. There's people who will help you get there.
Yeah, and I can sense if we were all in a room together, my colleagues at Eagle Labs would be cheering on that final answer. Mert, Insiya, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. Really great to see you. I hope to see you back in person one day very soon. Really interesting topic, that. The impossible. What is impossible? What remains impossible? Build a community.